Ghana, and we work across Africa. Sometime in December 2021, with the excitement around the continental free trade area, we decided to undertake an exercise to really look at the readiness of Africa's digital economy in 5 countries. We had then picked Kenya, Nigeria, Rwanda, South Africa, and Ghana. And what we chose to do in that report, and I must say a copy of this report is actually shared on the Africa Digital Rights website, was to really contextualize the legal and regulatory frameworks to assess its readiness in line with the continental free trade agreements, and at the time, the preparedness for a number of protocols to come on board, as well as our recognizing the importance of the digital economy to continental free trade. Essentially, the report recognized a number of good things, but also at the same time challenges, and made a number of recommendations to really help countries be ready. Now, this guide is something, a further work that we decided to undertake, thanks to Meta and Hewlett and Flora Parker Foundation, who immensely supported us through general grants and project-specific grants to undertake this assignment. Now, the aim of this guide is to really facilitate, an effective design of a data governance and a data protection framework within the context of the AfCFTA rules on digital trade and e-commerce, on the basis of the understanding of how important these areas, particularly data protection and data governance, will be to any digital trade or e-commerce protocol that is undertaken. And so the essence of the guide was to identify some of the maybe problem areas or challenges, or to unearth what the ecosystem really looks like now, what a protocol guide should be looking at, what countries should really be looking at when they are negotiating on these protocols. And so in the context of that, we undertook this exercise to really focus on certain aspects. So data governance, data protection implementation, cross-border data flows underpinning the digital economy, and then explore areas around rules and regulations that can ensure some level of certainty in the marketplace, as well as how to go about issues such as harmonization, inclusion, innovation, and cohesion within the context of the free trade agreement. Long story short, it's taken us quite a bit of time to really get to this point. And what we really invited you for, as you may have seen with the emails and the request, is that today we have a draft document, and we're going to use the consultant, the key consultant that we work with, Stella, to run through what we identified and the draft report, and to hope that we can elicit maybe some further ideas or some further prompting on things we should look at within the context of data protection and data governance, to help us really enrich the guide, so that at the end of the day, when it is launched, we can all have a document that we can be proud of. So really, the essence of this morning's exercise is to bring you all on board to, first of all, give you a glimpse of what this draft is looking at, and then also give the opportunity for you to share your ideas, your vision, and your thoughts with us so that we can enrich this document. I will like to say at this point that it is our hope that within the next month, based on the comments that we receive as well, we will be able to finish the document, input some of the comments that we come across, and then it will be launched officially and will be available like all ADRH documentation through our website to everybody that is interested in it. Without much ado, let me just at this point hand over to Stella, who was the main consultant, to run us through the guide. And I must say that because we do not have a lot of time and we do not want to take a lot of your time, she's going to use just about 20-25 minutes to highlight the key areas that this guide is looking at. And then we will open up, I'll come back again and open up and invite you for comments. Meanwhile, and questions. Meanwhile, whilst the conversation is ongoing, if you have any pressing questions as well, you can put them in the chat or put them up. I believe we have opportunities for questions, right? And so you can put them in the chat so that we'll pick it up. And then when Stella is done, she and myself will go through the questions and try and get as much responses and also feedback to you on the way forward. So thank you very much once again for joining us this morning. I will hand over to Stella to take us through the presentation. And mind you, before I hand over, remember that there will be 2 shared screens. Is it possible, Stella, for you to share your screen now so that we can enable everybody go through the respective screens? Yes, when you go to the view options on the top of your screen, you would see 2 options. The Africa Digital Rights Hub is the French version, and then clicking on Stella will give you the English version of the screen. Also remember that if you require interpretation for French, you should go to the interpretation column and then switch to French. Thank you very much once again. Stella, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Teki. I hope I am clear to everybody.
Yes, you are.
Thank you for those introductory remarks and for giving us a brief introduction to the guide, and also eliciting the objectives and the focus areas. Quickly, just to, as Teki has said, this is a draft that I have prepared and we have been working on. And we wanted to quickly show you the focus areas and to get your input on what we could add and how we can also make sure that we, at the end of the day, arrive at an effective data governance and protection frameworks within the African Continental Free Trade Area. So the structured presentation, as you can see, I will quickly run through the background. I will not go back to the objectives and the focus areas. I will look at the challenges relating to data governance in Africa, look at what we have observed in relation to data protection implementation in Africa, also restrictions on cross-border data transfers, what is the dynamic there, and the digital marketplaces in Africa, what are the challenges in relation to the data governance and data protection. We also look at MSMEs, in the digital economy, and then we shall look at the areas that we have come up with to address the challenges that I will be showing you, or what we have found through the course of our study. Now, as I said, I will not go back into the introduction or the background. I will skip that in the interest of time and quickly go to the challenges relating to data governance. Now, here, as you can see briefly, we have highlighted that the barriers to data sharing relate to availability of data for evidence-based policy making. There's also accessibility of data by various stakeholders, that is including the private sector, and also the quality of the data that is collected. So These are the challenges that relate to data sharing in Africa. Some of the challenges, you could always give us some more if we have missed something. And the causes, basically, as they have listed here, you can see that issues relating to isolated ICT investments. Now, this is obviously, especially it restricts interministerial cooperation, because if these investments are made in silos, then it makes it difficult for exchange of data across ministries, which is needed for making policy decisions in a timely and efficient manner. We also have a lack of absence of data analysis technologies. This makes it difficult to, of course, share data and for others to also interpret it or use it in other ways for innovation and so forth. There's also lack of regulatory, lack of all regulatory differences. I'm just gonna move this, sorry, go back. Which also restricts data sharing, and there's a lack of data standardization and harmonization and integration. Basically, that makes it difficult for efficient use, and also it also creates risks for misinterpretation, and also it hinders international collaboration if we do not have standardized data sharing systems or classifications or integration. Now, moving on to data protection implementation in Africa, here we see we look at the two sides of the same coin, in the sense that data protection is critical for building a digital trust in the digital economy, and it also fosters investment and innovation. On the other hand, if we do not have harmonized regulatory frameworks, there's a risk of, it poses us several challenges for digital trade. In the coming slide, you see here we have issues which relate to restrictions and cross-border transfers, because you want to protect data when there's no adequate data protection in the country in which is importing the data. Now, on the state of play, this is basically to show where we stand in Africa so far in terms of implementing data protection frameworks. And you can see that out of the 54 countries, so far there's only 36 countries that have established those laws. But of course, there's variations in terms of establishing the necessary institutional frameworks, of course, which also creates other which also impacts the effective implementation of the regulatory framework in terms of enforcement, basically. And then we have at the regional level some developments also, but as you can see, it's only the one in ECOWAS that has a binding force. So that means the others provide recommendations and are not binding on the countries. So this creates challenges in terms of having a harmonized regulatory environment, basically, which is important for the interconnected digital economy. In terms of the continental framework, we have the Marable Convention, which recently came into force, but it is criticized for having some shortcomings in terms of not defining key terms like not defining key terms in relation to personal data, and also omitting issues such as privacy impact assessments, and also not providing a mechanism for implementation at the regional level. So in terms of restrictions on cross-border data flows, we are looking at we're analyzing this from a trade perspective, and basically, this is because the digital protocol will be emanating from the African Continental Free Trade Area, which is basically a free trade agreement. And that means there's an underlying aspect of supporting cross-border trade. And within that, the policymakers have noticed that supporting data flows is very important in the digital economy. And that's why these issues become important to be discussed across governments, because they have an extraterritorial application to them. And so here we're looking at restrictions on cross-border flows. We are looking at the fact that they are critical for digitally enabled trade. Here, cross-border data flows are important for supply chains and also logistics and also trade in digital services. Now, if you look at the statistics, you will see that the trade in digital services is actually growing at an exponential rate in Africa, and it has surpassed trade in goods and services which are not supported by digital technologies, which is a tremendous development. And that means we have to harness that by making sure that we harmonize regulatory environments and also all the other issues that would inhibit its growth in terms of allowing businesses to scale across borders. Also, we're looking at the policy challenge here in terms of harmonizing the value which is created by digital technologies, but also trying to minimize the risks. Now, this is why I said that the subject of data protection and the digital trade comes within the ambit of international trade agreements, basically because the policymakers want to make sure that there's harmonization between or concerted efforts in addressing those two challenges, because the effects which the regulatory developments in one country will affect what happens in another country because of the interconnected nature of the digital economy. And then still on the analysis on trade policy, we are looking at resort to restrictions that impact regional trade. This emanates from the inability to arrive effectively at a balanced environment, or balancing the balancing the conflicting interests between the value that you create, the economic value derived from supporting digital trade, but also the risks that are involved. So some countries would then impose restrictions, as we can see that there's a prevalence of data localization requirements in Africa, and which impacts competition and internationalization for businesses that want to scale and expand across markets. They have to basically comply with various legal frameworks, which increases their cost of doing business. And then that also data localization requirements also reinforces existing inequality, infrastructure inefficiencies, and also it creates economic and trade implications. In terms of digital marketplaces in Africa, there are benefits that are accrued to businesses that are operating in these ecosystems. They can access new markets, and of course they have a reduction in operational costs because of the numerous services that can be consolidated within a platform. You think about payment systems, you think about in terms of communication, communicating with customers, communicating new products. And then also it provides an avenue for SMEs to integrate into the digital economy. And this could be as a result of the reduced costs for being on these platforms, that SMEs can easily access new markets at less costs or no costs at all. Now, there are challenges associated with these digital marketplaces. Keep in mind that we are talking about data governance and data protection. And here we look at the regulatory gaps and the heterogeneity in the regulatory frameworks, because we want to establish a continental protocol that should harmonize the regulatory environment. We have to see, okay, what are the gaps that are existing? And those gaps, as per now, are creating a challenge for businesses in leveraging the digital marketplaces across Africa. So in emphasizing on the issue of data governance and data protection, we are looking at establishing digital trust, which is very important for the users of the platforms, that is the businesses, but also for their customers, to make sure that issues like payments, there's trust that people will not be hesitant to support businesses that have broken into these marketplaces. And also, we want to make sure that the heterogeneity in the regulatory environment does not create a segmentation of digital markets, which for now we see because of the differences in regulating cross-border data flows. And another challenge relates to data management skills, especially for businesses within these marketplaces, in terms of ability to leverage the data created. Remember that our focus is also on creating data economies, but ability to leverage that data is still lacking because of an underlying issue of a low digital capacity in terms of human capital. And also in terms of digital management skills, in terms of complying with data protection laws. This is basically a law understanding of the regulatory framework, and also understanding what is required in terms of compliance, and also ability to comply in the sense that some of these, the compliance mechanisms could require them to establish processes that for now are not within their means or are costly. And also there's in terms of these businesses providing safeguards against data breaches. I think everybody is aware of the prevalence of cyber attacks and also cyber fraud. So issues like that have to be addressed. We also have a focus on MSMEs in the digital economy, and we find this very important because if you look at our facts and figures, you see that MSMEs represent 90% of the business environment in Africa, and it employs 60% of the workers, especially the women and youth. So as I said, that the digital marketplaces provide an entry point for SMEs to launch into the digital economy. So if they're the majority of the businesses that we have, that means we should zoom in on the needs that they have and the challenges that they face within the digital economy. And while also enabling them to take advantage of the opportunities. Some of the opportunities that we have listed here in terms of the MSME, what the African Continental Free Trade Area provides for MSMEs. We have access to new markets and reduction in transaction cost. This is from the increased economies of scale. And then there's an encouragement to formalize. We know that most of the SMEs are unregulated and also informal. There's also an opportunity for the different stakeholders to then coordinate and collaborate on integrating the MSMEs into the digital value chains. So the African Continental Free Trade Area provides that platform in which all stakeholders can take a lead in ensuring that SMEs are not left behind. In terms of data governance, concerns for SMEs, we have seen that there's a lack of focus of data governance frameworks on SMEs, in the sense that these frameworks are mostly addressed to big companies that have the resources to establish the required processes to manage data or to comply with data protection requirements. So that means we need to think outside the box and think of innovative ways on how to make sure that SMEs are also brought on board. As I have already mentioned, they are already using digital platforms. That means they are collecting data that brings them within the ambit of data collectors. And so we have to make sure that they are not left behind in meeting their obligation. We have also regulatory gaps and inconsistencies. I will not dwell so much on this. I think I have explained it in the previous slides. We also have the issue of complexity of rules and compliance requirements. And this is where our innovative thinking really has to come in, so that we can see how to make sure that these laws that are created can speak to the common man, basically, that they are not a preserve of the elite or people like us who are here, but how you think about that person who maybe you brings, I don't know, you buy from these just ordinary things that are using these apps. Do they understand what we are talking about here, and how can we make them understand? And we also think about the language in which we are using it. Most of these frameworks are in foreign languages, which we call the formal languages in African countries, like English, French, Portuguese, but those are not the languages that are spoken by the common man. So are we then effectively communicating to them what their responsibilities or their rights are? So the other issue, the last one, is about restrictions on cross-border transfers and how that affects SMEs. Of course, it affects all businesses in general. I will not dwell so much on that. I think I've already exhaustively explained it. Now, coming to how we can address the what we propose that the countries can look at, everybody who is involved in making sure that the African Continental Free Trade Area Protocol on Digital Trade and E-commerce comes to fruition and is effective. What we propose they should look at in terms of data governance and data protection. So we want to see, first of all, in terms of how the digital protocol should approach harmonization. Remember that our goal here is to make sure that we have a harmonized regulatory and legal and regulatory environment. But we think that focusing on key terms and concepts will help us to arrive at harmonization much better, because this allows us to have a common understanding of what we are talking about. So if we say data protection, it should be understood the same way in Morocco, in Uganda, in Zambia, in Zimbabwe, across the board. So we should understand it the same way. If we talk about restrictions relating cross-border transfers, we need to understand the objectives. I'm talking about here alignment in norms, values, and policies. When we talk about privacy, what are we talking about? What is the value? What are the values that we have as a society? So defining them so that they inform these restrictions that we write. But also when we talk about the restrictions, we need to understand that they restrict the main goal, which is to harness, to allow businesses to harness the digital technologies and to scale across borders. So those restrictions have to be then aligned and brought to an acceptable level of trade distortiveness. So we need to define basically our exceptions. I'll talk about this later. Usually when you have trade agreements, you will liberalize, but then you have to scale back and see, okay, we have some interests as nations that might diverge from each other. But the fact that we want to pursue those interests should not take us from the main goal of liberalizing our economies. So there's a balancing scale that has to be arrived at there. So this is what we are trying to engage the negotiators, all the stakeholders into, to make sure that we are clearly aligned in what we are providing. And also providing a mix of time-bound and progressive regulatory convergences. Time-bound here in the sense that if you look at data protection, as I showed you on the state of play in Africa, not all countries have established these laws, and those which have established, some of them have not established the required national data protection authorities. So issues like that are very critical for establishing digital trust. So we could foresee some timelines for countries that have not established such frameworks. But then we can also provide for progressive regulatory convergence for some other issues. So we are trying to nudge negotiators or all stakeholders to think about these things in a broader sense. What should be time-bound and what should we provide as progressive, on a progressive regulatory basis? Could it be issues like closing the digital divide? Because yes, that involves a lot of resources that most countries probably are resource constrained. So yeah, that is what we are envisioning here. And then there's an issue. It is a proposal to look at the Marable Convention and other regional models and national privacy and data protection frameworks. This is basically to ensure that we have a more harmonized regulatory environment if we make reference to these existing frameworks. If we pick the principles, the standards, and the rules that have been recommended in there, if countries within, let's say, in ECOWAS or in East Africa or in SADC are following that model, that will help more the businesses within those regions. So at least that should be a starting point. If you cannot aim higher for the overall continental regulations, let's try to at least have a harmonization within the regions. In terms of cross-border data transfers, we are looking at a binding commitment on liberalization of data flows. This is very important, and we want it to be comprehensive and equivocal. But we are also, as I said, when we come to trade agreements, there's always, countries always have what we call policy space to pursue legitimate public policy objectives, which in most cases differ from each other. So we want the negotiators and all stakeholders involved to consider that, but to make sure that we do not digress from the objective of integrating, we want to encourage that these exemptions are provided. They provide exemptions in a narrow scope, not too broad, so that we are very clear on what we are exempting, and also to establish criteria upon which the veracity can be tested. We also encourage for a risk-based approach to regulating cross-border data flows. So this means countries would have basically to sit down and have like a classification system and say, okay, which one is high risk, low risk, and what are the different requirements within those categorizations. So that helps to eliminate blanket restrictions on cross-border data flows. And then we also recommend providing for alternative mechanisms for fostering cross-border data flows, because we recognize that it is not possible, because of the risks involved, it is not possible to have no limitations at all, because remember, we also have to protect the society from issues like security, safety, of the transactions, their personal data not to be illegally accessed, and things like that. So we have to make sure that we provide alternative mechanisms that companies can rely on within the laws. So companies can rely on these measures to enjoy cross-border data flows, but knowing that they have to meet the obligations relating to their privacy and data protection. So the rationale for providing these mechanisms, as I've already said, would cover for areas for countries that do not have the established framework, or to cover for the gaps or disparities that exist across the borders. One of the mechanisms that we are thinking about is adequacy decisions. This is in terms of harmonization and mutual recognition. If you know how the EU operates, they have a very strict data protection regime, and in there they provide for adequacy decisions, and a number of countries have been granted this. So also African countries are like in Uganda and Kenya, they provide for this data protection laws provide for this mechanism for facilitating cross-border data flows. The only difference is that the laws do not provide the criteria on which these adequacy decisions would be established. So adequacy decision is basically the country, say the country of export, establishing that the country to which data is going to be imported to has an adequate or equivalent level of data protection as the country from which data is going to be exported. So here we want to make sure that the African Continental Free Trade Area, the digital rules establish those as that assessment, the criteria for making that assessment. Still on the mechanisms, we are proposing model contractual clauses, which are also sometimes called standard contractual clauses. These are fixed contracts, clauses that companies can incorporate within their business operations as they contract with data analysts or people who are processing data, so they can use this, and this can of course ease the business, because it does not involve a lot of cost. They don't have to keep on thinking about new ways to craft this or engaging lawyers, but you have a standard which is approved by the competent authority that then businesses can keep using within their contracts and can be applied at a sectoral level. We also another mechanism we are proposing is the binding corporate rules. This works when you have intra-group data transfers. For example, multinationals operating in Africa across different African countries can employ this, and that could help some multinationals or businesses operating in Africa where there's no regulatory frameworks for data protection and or where there's inconsistencies, so they can use this so that they can show that they are transferring data to those areas, but the countries that are, or their group that is receiving them is providing the required protection that the sending country requires. Then we also have the certification system, other systems that we are proposing relate to certification, codes of conduct, and then international standards. The codes of conduct basically voluntary. This could also be done at a sectoral level where the you could have a body that then would certify that members who seek to join that trade association are in compliance. And then there's international standards. If you've heard of the ISO, International Standards Organization, they have a privacy standards that businesses can use. So it shows how to incorporate the various requirements within the business operations or the organizations, even governments. Certification system, that is African countries have a lot of experience in using certification systems. I'll give an example. When we are trading in goods, if you want to export some, let's say avocado to the EU, you have to meet certain health requirements, you know, in terms of pesticide residues and all that. To do that, you need to certify that that product fulfills certain requirements. So there's a lot of experience in using certification systems, and we thought, okay, why don't we include this within the protocol? Because then in areas where we have not yet established these frameworks, private sectors can already run with these mechanisms and ensure that business continuity is not hampered by lack of regulatory frameworks, which take time to establish. In regard to rules and regulations to ensure a certainty in the digital marketplace, we are looking at adopting rules on digital signatures and electronic authentication, basically to ensure that there's validity of online contracts, to give them the same equivalence as paper-based. There's something that can already be referenced. We don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can use the on-sitio model. And also we can also provide for customer rights in regarding to data collection, use, storage, and disposal. So people who are using these platforms should know, there should be an avenue. Every platform should provide this information so that when I use it, I should know. If I use Jumia, I should be able to find their privacy policy within that platform, so that I know what my rights are, what they're using my data for, who is accessing it. So this is what we want to make sure that is included in the protocol, so that these requirements are harmonized across the board. We're also looking at clarifying on obligations, because there's a variety of players within these platforms. Some obligations might not be clear. Remember, I talked about SMEs using these digital market platforms, but also remember that they have challenges in meeting their compliance requirements or even understanding what their obligations are. So we need to be clear when these platforms are established, that there's clarification on who is responsible for what. In terms of SMEs, how can we enable them to harness the benefits of the digital economy while at the same time allowing them or empowering them to safeguard privacy and take advantage of the value that data governance provides? We are thinking that there should be a need, simplifying regulatory frameworks will allow for addressing the complexity of the legal and administrative processes. Remember that I talked about the terms used are very technical and maybe off-putting for people. Sounds like very out of scope for them. So we need to find ways to translate this into simple terms, but also I talked about languages, you know, to make sure that we speak to the common man on what is required. If someone hears data protection, we should be able to break it down to an understandable level. And also to enhance compliance, basically, and to ensure that there's digital trust and promote inclusivity. So we want to avoid a one-size-fits-all. Data governance frameworks and data protection frameworks should not be too technical, but they should address the common man. So what actions are we proposing here? We are thinking about technical assistance on information management and data protection. We have these, if you look at the ease of doing business, if you look at this, should I say, initiatives that are provided within that, you could find that there's lots of guides that are used. I know in the trade environment, if you look at the WTO, it has what we call the trade facilitation agreement, where countries committed to provide, simplified trade, systems, to simplify them so that businesses can understand them. So we're looking at things like that. You could provide it through apps. Businesses can also assess their digital readiness. They can assess maybe their compliance levels. We are trying to nudge the stakeholders to think outside the box so that we can include everybody. We are looking also at the digital continental rules to provide these frameworks so that we can have some harmonization. In terms of fostering inclusion and innovation and cohesion, our rationale here, we're looking at creating an enabling environment for innovation-driven entrepreneurship in Africa, and also creating data-driven innovation ecosystems. We also want to enable policymakers to keep up with the changing business models. Remember that digital economy is highly innovative. Digital technologies are creating new business models literally every day, and those business models entail certain privacy challenges or data governance challenges that policymakers have to address. And also we want to promote coordination and cooperation across Africa. Now, we have some actions that we have picked from some existing frameworks within countries, but also trade agreements that have been signed elsewhere outside Africa, where we see some actions that we could foster innovation also in Africa. Of course, we contextualize to fit within our existing needs, also constraints, capacity. If you look at regulatory sandboxes, we have here innovative projects that involve cross-border flow of data could be harnessed through regulatory sandboxes, because this would allow learning across the board before we have before we lock in on commitments. They could be, regulators could learn across the board and see, okay, how does these new business models or innovations, how do they affect privacy and data protection? What are the issues? And then from there, we have, a sort of shared learning, and then harmonize the regulatory environment. Of course, this is very costly, maybe not for Africa, maybe for those who have the resources can already establish it, but yeah. Then we have innovation offices, which could be something that the African countries can jump on immediately, because we already have existing frameworks. If you think about promotion of foreign direct investment, you have investment offices. So this is something similar. When you have an innovation office, you want to facilitate regulator-innovator exchange, basically, and learning within an innovation environment. So you could have exchange of information on application of data governance frameworks that could be provided to innovators, to businesses through that office. So that office is just created for that purpose. And this option actually is less costly for capital constrained countries, or even for businesses, because it's just an office and you can always expand on what you provide as the means become available. That is for businesses and also for governments. And also we have open data, open government data. This is something I know in Kenya, it's already provided. And Africa, it does not really score well on the globally in terms of providing access to public information for various challenges. But we want to encourage this, keeping in mind that this should be also provided within a safe environment, in that the information that is provided is has safeguards for privacy and personal data, so that businesses can use the information to innovate. And then startups. Startup Acts. This is basically to facilitate the startup ecosystem. And we're thinking that because some African countries have already started to create these regulatory environments for startups, through which they provide incentives and address some of the challenges that startups face, it could also be an avenue to provide greater emphasis on a need for privacy and data protection and data governance assistance to the startups and the innovators engaged in them. The last one we are thinking about is the digital free economic zones. This is something that we are picking from economic zones that usually relate to facilitating trade in goods and services within certain regions in countries. So we think that if countries can provide for something like that, which would increase innovation in Africa by providing access to foreign investment in the digital economy, where maybe foreign investors will allow us to bring even some ITC infrastructure that we are missing, but we incentivize them to do that by providing tax breaks, the same way that it works within the free economic zones. But what we are thinking here, we could say that, okay, maybe the incentives could be conditional based on maintenance of robust data governance and data protection frameworks. Yeah, so that is where our draft stands for now. We, as Teki said, we are looking forward to your comments, your additions, contributions. We want to make sure that we give you your say. We want to hear what you think. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Stella, for this comprehensive work. And like I said, we know that we are limited in terms of your time in here. And so we do not want to overstretch the time, but this is the time you can maybe raise your hands and then unmute your mic. I see a hand up already. So that you can ask your question. Jean Premier, I'm suspecting you would speak in French. Is that it? So in that case, the English people can switch to English. Please go ahead, unmute your mic and ask your question. Jean, we can't hear you. Jean Premier. Okay, I don't know, Roland, have you muted everybody? Can we unmute him if we are the ones controlling that?
Yes, he can unmute himself.
Yes.
So if he's speaking in English or French, we have to switch to...
Yes, but I'm in English, but I can't hear anything. Okay, now he's unmuted, so please go ahead with the question.
I got difficulties actually to unmute, but now it's fine.
Okay.
Thank you, Stella, for the comprehensive presentation and the study that really tackled on all aspects of the digital trade and the concerns we currently have as they're moving toward the adoption, the finalization of the protocol on digital trade. First of all, let me indicate that I'm from Rwanda. Though my name is in French, but I'm from Rwanda.
Okay.
So I've seen that you've
and just to not to cut you, I think if you, because we know a lot of people register. We don't know everybody. So for benefit, just tell us your name, where you're coming from, and what you do to just help us. Thank you.
Thank you. Mine is actually about the good recommendations and proposals that are highlighted in the report. But I was wondering how the rest of the continent will come to know the outcomes of this report and the study actually. Because as you said, you are now 5 countries, but I think that this is very important and it's really helpful as we are finalizing the negotiations on the protocol on digital trade. And I was also wondering how you maybe collaborate with the AfCFTA Secretariat so that before we accomplish the negotiations on the protocol on digital trade, they may ensure that all the recommendations highlighted here are taken into consideration. I know very well that some of them, issues around cross-border data transfers have been discussed, localization of computing facilities, and even the general consideration on aligning our national laws and regulation instruments to the protocol, but still, it looks good if this report is shared with the Secretariat and to ensure that actually all the recommendations and the highlights are considered in the final version of the protocol. That's what I wanted to highlight. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry, you said you were coming from Rwanda, but which sector do you work for? Private sector, CSO, or government?
From the Ministry of Trade and Industry,
Okay.
and actually I'm e-commerce specialist at the ministry.
Okay.
And I'm representing the ministry in the ongoing negotiations of the protocol on digital trade.
Okay,
thank you.
Thank you. First of all, I hope this will be useful. And so one of the reasons for developing this report is for people like yourselves, because we were very much aware of the challenges that face, particularly the data governance and data protection space in terms of technical knowledge and all of that. And when you're bringing that with trade protocols and trade negotiations. And so we really undertook this assignment to bring the two sides together and to explore what findings can be made. On the recommendations, I must say that we had actually reached out on this draft to the AfCFTA Secretariat, and we intend to follow up and, if possible, even have a one-on-one meeting with them on the report and the findings. And we are prepared. That is why we undertook this exercise, to enhance research in this area and on these particular issues at that level. So since you are also part of the trading protocol, I think what we will do is that once the final report is out, we will make it readily available. You could also be our mouthpiece because, of course, CSOs like us do not sit at the negotiating table. But once you are there, you also have capacity to raise some of these things that we have done through research. And that is really the essence of this exercise, so that you are armed with the research that is required to also push for some of these recommendations whilst you are negotiating for the protocol. So we are happy to come back to you. If you can just share your email, maybe privately with me or the Africa Digital Rights page, so that we can follow up and see what work we could do together, both with yourselves and then also with the AfCFTA Secretariat. But we are reaching out to the Secretariat and we'll take it from there. Jean, you still have your hand up. Are there any further questions? Yes.
Thank you. Maybe my last question, it's about the sampled countries. Do you have in the maybe in the detailed report
Yes.
some specificities on the study findings?
Yes.
For Rwanda, for Nigeria, Ghana, so that we may actually position ourselves, know where we are, and the required efforts to maybe reach the level we want to, where you want to be.
Okay, so I must say that first research that focused on the 5 African countries is already published, and it's available on the Africa Digital Rights Hub website. And so if you go there now, you're able to pick a copy of it. This exercise is a different exercise, even though we based a lot of the work that we are doing on the findings that we made from that earlier research. So the earlier research is published, and we had components on what we found on each of the countries, and then overall recommendations from there, of which this exercise is our way of also addressing some of the recommendations that we had made in the earlier exercise. I believe our office have actually put a link in the chat to the report, and so you'll be able to have access to that there. Before I hand over to Hepson, I'm seeing a question from Sheila. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question, or do you want me to just read and address it? Stella, so you are asking about, will data localization be between us and other FTA, or will it only apply to us as state parties under the AfCFTA? So right now, we do not have a clue of the extent to which the protocol is really addressing data localization issues. What we know is that the data localization issues will be a challenge to really getting over the issues around digital trade. And so our proposal here is both for the countries, because the countries are the ones that are mandated to negotiate with the Free Trade Secretariat, to negotiate amongst themselves. So once the countries are negotiating and armed with these issues, some of the proposals and recommendations that we're making in this report can actually enable you know, okay, which aspects should I look at? One of the things we recognize is that it will be extremely challenging, right, to get all African countries to be on the same page, to have uniform laws, to have the exact same standards. But what we are really, and we also recognize that data localization is a challenge. And so it is important, particularly for countries that also have data localization laws, to start thinking around, first of all, will this allow us to freely work? If it does not, what derogations can we look at to enable data sharing? And in the recommendations, we've made a number of recommendations, right? Both at the sectorial level, at the global level, that allows movement of data, because with the digital trade, once you're not able to move data, essentially you're stifling digital trade. And if you have laws that say that my data should only stay in Ghana and cannot move out, and there are very stringent restrictions around the data moving out, there are bound to be challenges. So these are both issues that countries that are negotiating should look at within the protocol. And then also the AfCFTA itself must look at and come up with recommendations that can really enable us do some of these things effectively. If I haven't answered your question thoroughly, I'll just ask you to just raise your hand again, and then I'm coming to you, Heshbon, so that you can ask your question. Sorry, pardon me if I have not mentioned your name correctly. Please tell us where you're coming from and who you're representing, and then go ahead with your question.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the good presentation we've had today. My name is Hasbon Omanjo, and I'm from Deloitte, Nairobi, Kenya. Work in the space of data analytics, data governance, and actually we're in the process of examining and coming up with a data governance blueprint, for which the topics which you talked about were very, very interesting. And I'm happy that we ended up talking about a critical challenge, which has to do with sharing of open data for governments, which came towards the tail end of the presentation. I think it was on some aspect of fostering inclusion and innovation. But I wish it would actually gain a lot of prominence much earlier in the report. I think when you're looking at the general challenges for data governance, because what we are seeing in our research is that data in Africa specifically is normally secret by default. And so even within countries, you'll find governments are not sharing that data within different ministries or with the public. And even worst case, when you're looking at the different blocks, so you may find SADC may want to engage, say, with the EAC, and that information will not definitely be translated across the different blocks. So it would be good if it gains some prominence. At least maybe what I would suggest is we look at the universally accepted open data principles, which I know the first principle normally talks about data being open by default. And so it would be good that we move from secret by default to open by default. And then also, of course, there are elements there that foster inclusion and innovation simply because data is being shared. It would be good to see if, let's say I am in Kenya, for instance, and there's opportunity in maybe making an investment in Ghana, and that the government of Ghana decides which data is going to be open and accessible so that we can participate. I think that would actually be of great benefit to the data governance challenges we face, and also those. So that's my submission. Thank you very much once again for the presentation.
Thank you. That's a very useful comment. And Stella, I don't know, I've responded to a number of the questions, but I don't know whether you want to add something to the questions I have so far responded to. Thank you very much, Esbon. I believe we're taking notes also, and I completely agree with you. We must look at the open government aspect and then see how we can also expand and enrich the aspects on fostering innovation, inclusion, and cohesion. Stella, do you have any comments? Please, meanwhile, keep your comments coming in, and you can raise your hands if you have any comments or inputs. I'm seeing some people I know, so I feel like I need to push them. If nobody's raising their hands. Stella, yeah, just...
Yeah, I think in the interest of time, you have exhaustively answered Sheila Nekesa's question. And I would not wish to dilute what you have said. I appreciate Hesbon's recommendation. That is very significant. It's critical. If you look at the statistics, African countries are not faring well at all in terms of open government data, which is very essential when we talk about harnessing the digital space, and also for innovation, basically, and also for policy making across the different sectors. So that is very important, and we shall look into your comment, and we shall definitely address it. I just put it at the end because that is where we thought it was fitting for now, but not that we gave it it still has the weight that it carries. It's just that it was best suited for the area focus on innovation. Yeah.
So much. Please, we still want a lot of comments to enrich this process. Like I said, I am seeing some people that I know. So unfortunately for them, I may have to ambush them. Dr. Shillon, I don't know whether you're still here. I saw you earlier. Are you here? Because Meta supported this process, and I just want to get wind of where Meta stands on some of these issues. Dr. Shillon, are you on the call? I see her here, but she's not responding. Dr. Boshe, it's so strange, but your names are coming after each other. So if we could hear from you what your initial comments are on this.
Yes, I'm around, Turkey.
Yes.
Basically, I hadn't had time to go through the report myself. I just joined the meeting because I saw it on my feed, LinkedIn feed, and I said, this is interesting to listen in. And I wasn't aware that the report had already been published. But listening to what the report and the recommendations, I think it is very important that you came up with this report and these recommendations at this time, because I think we are moving into something when it comes to cross-border trade. We will need to have clarity on matters, for example, as you spoke before, data localization and how that's going to affect trade within the African continent. I think there's a need to address this matter because, as we all know, some countries do not have such policies, and some others have even stricter policies on data localization, which might affect trade relations between and within African continent. So I think those are important aspects that need to be highlighted and communicated so that they can be resolved, and so that we come up with a framework that really assist and promote trans-border trade, movement of goods, services, and people, without, bringing unfair terms among or within other countries. So for me, I think the highlight is basically the aspect of data localization and how that might affect trans-border data trade within Africa. So for me, that is kudos. And I think this report is really, really necessary and important at this stage.
Okay, so yes, just a bit of clarification, maybe because you joined us a little late. So this is like a draft report. So what we are seeking to do is to elicit, more comments and inputs on, what would be the best way forward. Of course, the 2021 report is an earlier work that we had done, and we are building on with this particular exercise. And please raise your hand if you have any comments and inputs, so that we can, we really need all the ideas on board to enrich this process, especially because once it's published, what we want to do is to at least try and engage with the various countries that are also doing their negotiations, to help them identify these are some of the critical areas you should be looking at, particularly around digital trade, around data governance, and data protection as well. Thank you so much, Patricia. So,
sorry.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I should mention here that we are thinking outside the box. So just to let our participants know, think about things that could make what we are trying to do, what could make it work, what the African Continental Free Trade Area is trying to achieve, what could make it work. So in our draft, we have showed you that we have picked learnings from other regions. Of course, we try to make sure we contextualize. We have also picked learnings within our own countries. What is working? How have businesses been helped to understand other regulatory frameworks that seem complex? And how can we incorporate that into digital related laws and frameworks. So think of that, think of what we have proposed. Would it work? If I talk about innovation offices, does that sound, what does that sound like to you? If we talk about a digital free economic zone, what does that, what do you think would be the challenges? What should we highlight? Essentially, we want to make sure that we don't just copy paste things that are existing elsewhere, but we want to make sure that we think critically about them and we do some serious impact assessment. We want to urge our countries, like we were talking about cross-border data transfers, and also data localization. We need the countries to assess really, the benefit or the objective that they want to achieve with that, as opposed to the economic benefit that would be foregone. So we want to engage in that and not just do blanket, restrictions. So I talked about a risk assessment approach. What do you think about that? How does that work? Do you have some examples of African countries where you say that was maybe implemented here, but we are facing these kind of challenges that you could highlight for us, and we could already look into, okay, what can we recommend to go about that challenge? So basically what we have done is push ourselves as far as we could go to think outside the box, to make sure that we'll come up with something that is practical. We know that in Africa we have challenges in terms of constraints, in terms of resources. So we don't want to wait for the countries so much in terms of establishing the required regulatory frameworks. And also we know that the data protection authorities in most cases underfunded, So if we rely so much on waiting for these harmonized environments, as Teki has already said, harmonization is not, we cannot have a total, harmonized environment where everything looks exactly the same. There's always going to be differences, and those differences will create challenges. But we want to see, how do we manage when those challenges come up? So by having something that is more nuanced and multifaceted, we want to make sure that we understand these different issues. What are our different complaints? I've talked about SMEs, what their challenges are for now. Maybe there's something else we have not highlighted. Maybe there's something that you think, okay, maybe this could work in this way. How can they better harness that digital platforms? Maybe some of you are already here and you have side businesses on those platforms. What do you think we could, add? So in summary, please just think outside the box and let us know what you think, what is working in your country, what is working in your systems, and that we could incorporate here. So there's a lot of learning we are doing through different areas, regions, systems. I've talked about also certification systems. This is something that is being done in Asia, and it was picked up also in the agreements between the US, Canada, and Mexico. So where they actually referenced a certification system that is developed in Asia, and then they incorporated it into their trade agreement to show that, okay, let's not try to reinvent the wheel. There's something that is happening here. And what you actually need to do is to appoint an authority that would certify, So African countries have a lot of experience with things like this certification. Let's not wait so much for governments to do this. But the reason for mentioning all these mechanisms is we want them to come through the protocol, because that gives more credibility, to systems that are already existing in Africa, and as well as it gives us as stakeholders, as policy people who advocate for policies, to have something to run with, because you have committed here. So let's try to implement this as we wait for you to establish the required regulatory environment. So I thought that's, let me maybe raise that, and that could maybe nudge you to think of some ideas that you can bring forth. Fear not.
Thank you very much, Stella. I think that was a good nudge. And so, but I'm also looking at the quietness here to mean that maybe we have, we have been great enough to look at almost all issues. And this has probably provided a food for thought as well for people to go back and reflect on. What we can do is that we will do well to share the presentations. Roland, is it possible for us to do that to everybody that participated today? And then we'll give it maybe a few days to allow the participants those who joined us today, those who couldn't, to look at their presentations and maybe share some feedback, further feedback or comments with us. Like I mentioned, we will try as much as possible to conclude this exercise in the next month. And so being willing participants to share your views and all and your thoughts and even joining this process. What we will do is that once the final document, the document is launched, we will still have a virtual launch. So you'll be invited to the launch, and then we will share copies of the documents once they are available after the launch. Like I had said earlier, particularly those ones that are joining us from countries that are in their respective trade units or that are negotiating the protocols. We are more than happy to sit and also have some further conversations around the documents. Of course, we're also prepared to share the document under a strict non-disclosure until it is launched. We're prepared to share the drafts also for your inputs on that. So if you want to be part of that, please send us a detailed emails and we'll work around that. But otherwise, I just want to say a very big thank you, Stella, for really pushing and allowing us to push you, even with the trade background, to think, you know, innovatively around these issues, and for coming up with this very, very good report, which I believe will be a useful guide to everybody that is participating, both at the free trade agreement level, both at the continental, regional, and the country levels, that is really participating in the negotiating of the protocols. Without much ado, I think we've saved you some 30, maybe 39 minutes that you can just use in going back and reflecting on the rest of the day. So thank you very much. You can reach us, the email that you can reach us that have been shared in the chat as well with you. This event was recorded and also shared live. So I believe it will be on our YouTube channels and on our Facebook channel. So it also gives you the opportunity to go back to it in case it's a little bit too rushed for you to digest everything else that was shared today. Like I said, our interest is in your comments, your candid comments, and ideas on really how to ensure that we can make this possible. We will actually indulge you to follow Africa Digital Rights Hub on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Twitter. And that way you're able to get access to a lot of our content, as well as our website. You can visit our website where most of our documentation and research work is also shared. Thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for those that were able to provide their comments and spoke to us. We greatly appreciate. And I also would like to say thank you to the ADRH team, Linda, Roland, Ifua, and particularly Stella. Thank you for really making this possible as well. I will not say much at this point, and have a wonderful day, everyone.